So, what am I presenting about? Lifelong learning on the inclusive web. And that's a fairly mundane title. But one of the things that my team members talk about is Jutta's law of magnetic dates. If any one important thing is supposed to happen on any one day, everything else that is important will happen on the same day. And so one of the presentations that you're missing has a much less mundane title. It's called Salad Dressing, Pendula, Navel, Scrape Knees, and Future-Friendly Learning. Now, I had to send my colleague, Jess Mitchell, to present this, and you might ask, oh my goodness, what does this have to do with the topic? Well, it actually does have much to do with the topic, and so for those of you for whom some of the things I'm talking about are old news and things you already know, you can multitask and think about what does salad dressing, pendula, navel, scrape knees, and future-friendly learning have to do with the web and education. I'm going to talk, though, I'm going to start my talk with something that I think is still interesting, and that is venomous snakes, and specifically something called the cobra effect. Does anyone in the room know what is meant by the cobra effect? No? Okay. So the cobra effect was something that was first noted by a German economist named Horst Sievert. And he was talking about a phenomenon that happened in colonial India, specifically in Delhi. The British rulers decided that they needed to get rid of the venomous snakes in the city. And so what they did was they decided to put a bounty on dead cobras. You bring in a dead cobra and you get a lot of money. And that worked initially, but then some enterprising Dalians or Indian individuals decided that they could breed cobras and that in that way get quite a bit of money. So all of a sudden, all sorts of cobra breeding farms grew up and people were continuing to get the bounty for cobras. The supposedly intelligent British rulers decided, okay, then we just get rid of the bounty and we'll get rid of the farms. But can anybody think about what might have happened once you got rid of the bounty? Any thoughts? Right. So the farmers decided the cobras were no longer of use, and they just released them out of the farms. So what happened was the intended effect was in fact, the opposite effect happened, obviously. So what does this have to do with web accessibility? And what does this have to do with education? I want to tell you a few stories. I travel quite a bit through schools. I work with the Department of Education in the US. I work with many different education authorities here in Canada and in the US. And there are a number of instances where I had this feeling of, oh my goodness, what have we done? As you know, or as you may not know, if you read the bibliography or biography, I have been involved in web accessibility right from probably the very beginning and have been a very active participant along with my team on the Web Accessibility Initiative. And so this is not a critique of the Web Accessibility Initiative. It's a self-critique and a reconsideration of where are we going and what are we doing. So the first story is about a young boy named Casey, and I was shown into a school, and there is something called EQAOA, which is, it doesn't matter what it is. There's all these acronyms throughout education, but suffice it to say, there is legislation in several jurisdictions that tests have to be accessible. And so I was shown into a classroom and was shown, oh my goodness, look at this. We have a model accessible test. And I watched as this young boy named Casey had to go through 32 steps on a single switch scanning keyboard to hit the submit button for his test. Now, yes, he did have extra time because that was part of his independent education plan. But just think of the cognitive load and the physical load of the mechanics of the test, and how much that would overweigh, and it did in fact overweigh, much of what he was being tested for. But the teacher was quite proud because it was WCAG compliant. I went to another classroom, and there, I had been there the year before, and there was wonderful, highly interactive, highly image-intensive content that was very, very supportive of students that were visual learners and individuals with dyslexia in the class. And I discovered that the teacher had removed all images, had removed all interactivity, and anything that involved experiential learning, because it wasn't WCAG compliant. And then I went to an IEP meeting, which is an individual education plan meeting, and there the discussion was about the progression of a student and what area the student should be, or how the student should be streamed. Should this student go into a vocational stream or an academic stream? And this student was clearly very bright, clearly interested in more of the theory rather than the vocational aspect of learning. But the argument was, we meet all the WCAG success criteria, therefore it must be the student. The student is obviously not capable of academic studies. So, are we inadvertently causing some COBRA effects? And I'm not saying that everything we do. And of course, I'm completely supportive of what we've been doing. But I think what we're doing is we are intervening, we are causing interventions in a complex adaptive system. We have in this system politics, regulations, economics, families come into play, communities come into play, media come into play, private enterprise comes into play, and they all either use or abuse the things that we are providing, the tools, the strategies, the regulations, the success criteria, the techniques, the laws, the regulations. And we need to think very carefully about what we're doing. And here's one of those effects of the two things interacting. Education is not only a complex adaptive system, but it's a complex adaptive system within systems. And the student is in the middle, and the student is the one that receives the effect of all of these interactions. So we can call accessible education a wicked problem. Does anyone know what well, you have the definition is up there. A wicked problem is a problem that is difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements that are often difficult to recognize. You have no clear solution, unforeseen outcomes. It involves changing behaviors. It's interdependent and multi-causal, and it's very, very complex. And if we were to look at, so where does the accessible education or accessibility and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and the Web Accessibility Initiative and Accessible Web and Education intersect? They intersect at the point of the student. We have a common goal, or we should have a common goal, that every learner needs to succeed, every learner should reach the optimum in terms of education. But if we were to say, or if we were to grade the education system on the assignment to enable all students to reach their diverse full potential so that they can be prosperous, self-guided contributors to our global community, I would say, and I think there is general consensus, that our education system has failed. So education needs to change. And this change will benefit learners with disabilities. Web accessibility needs to support this change. And web accessibility needs to consider additional approaches in order to avoid the COBRA effects and in order to support the way that education needs to change. So how does education need to change? And I think there's a growing consensus in 21st century learning, in transformation of education and next generation learning communities, that there are specific things that need to happen within our education system. And I think we can all agree that these will benefit learners who are currently excluded. Some of the changes that have been identified is we need to view learning as lifelong and not a stage set of age-linked grades or degrees. You can see how this will benefit learners with disabilities. We need to empower learners to assess and guide their own learning. If you're an extremely divergent learner, if you have huge learning differences, it's highly unlikely that you're going to find someone that's going to support you through your lifelong journey. You're going to have to become the expert of your learning requirements. We need to value and recognize a diversity of skills and competencies that is potentially as diverse as the diversity of learners. And this is maybe the hardest change to swallow because, of course, much of our education system, as I'll talk about, is about conformance and standardization of learning. This is the thing that I think would be quite disruptive, this notion that we need to value the diversity and the divergent skills and competencies that everybody brings to the education system. And we need to support collaboration and collective production over competition with others. And here again, our education system is very much about competition. So, how do we do this? One of the difficulties is that our education system is actually constructed to be change resistant. It was built as a stronghold against parochialism and superstition. It is built to resist the transitory political forces and the whims of popular ideologies, and this is a good thing. Just imagine if Trump and the Tea Party were the ones that were fully controlling our education systems. There are reasons to be change resistant. It has created these protected silos of expertise. It is intended to defend accepted values and proven knowledge from upstarts and peerless notions, so that only the most critical and the most tested rise to the top. It's intended, however, also to become conformant. When our education system moved to educating at scale, when we decided that education needed to be available to everyone, we moved to mass education. And there was also the industrial demand for interchangeable workers. We wanted factory laborers, we wanted office workers that could be interchanged, so when one left, the next one could replace them, and so they needed the same skills. It's standardized. This was initially intended, or many of the standardization systems that we've created, everything from the Common Core in the US to the various PISA or PIAC, and these are other acronyms within education. It's actually not useful to know what each of the acronyms means. Just they're an alphabet soup of acronyms that we've created, are intended to support equality across education systems. But what happens is we create centralized authorities of education, and this unintentionally confiscates self-determination from teachers and students. And if you're a parent, you've probably thought a lot about how the teachers are teaching to the test rather than teaching the content. Our education systems have also become highly competitive. We sort the deserving from the undeserving. We have a scarcity of time, we have a scarcity of resources, and so it's driven by what are the priorities deemed by our political system and deemed by the market. Hard science is at the expense of arts and humanities, formula over play, and sequential competencies over discovery and creativity. We bolster elitism, competition, and exclusion. We sort and filter before students are fully formed. How many of you went through a streaming system where you had to decide very, very early on whether you were going to go to college or university, whether you were going to go into a vocational stream or not? How many of you have children where that decision is made well before the maturity level? Our tests are deterministic, they're sticky. Even the tests that we take in preschool are now deterministic of where we go. So and actually, there are hot housing infants who go through psychometric tests to see which direction they should take. And we, through all of that, ignore the self-fulfilling prophecy phenomenon. A student will do what the student is expected to do. It will perform as they're expected, irrespective of what their actual skills are. So all of this is really not in line with today's reality. We're already in a knowledge economy. We have creative economies. Our markets are changing very quickly. We know we no longer need to produce human calculators. We no longer need to produce human hard drives. We can use the web. We can use the various systems that are online. And we no longer need to produce human worker clones. We need diverse learners. Anything that can be done redundantly or repetitively can be done by machines. And many of the professions that have repeatable work within them are professions that are disappearing. So we need to prepare our students not to do redundant work, but to do unique, creative, diverse work. Oops, sorry. We do need diverse perspectives, diverse learners, critical thinking, creativity and innovation, collaboration, and especially students, graduates, learners that can navigate complexity. We've been designing for scarcity, for a time when knowledge was scarce, knowledge storage and access was constrained, only select members could arbitrate and bequeath knowledge. Authority structures were centralized to guard the castle, and only the elite few could compete to climb the ladder to higher knowledge. Now we are, however, in an age where we have introduced through the web and through many of the new innovations that are part of the market, an age of abundance. Knowledge is there for the taking. We're connected to a bounty of experts. There are no constraints on stored information. We have tools that can help us self-monitor and self-regulate our progress. Everyone must climb the ladder to participate productively in our society. Collaboration is essential to deal with the complexity of our connected world, and we require diversity and creativity, not conformity. And there is no end to learning. The world is changing. Learning is never complete. Many of the truths that you will have learned one year in school will no longer be the case the next year. And there are new forms of work each year. So that's the state of education. I don't think there's anyone, or is there anyone in the room here that disagrees that our education system needs to change? No, there's no hands. Okay, so what does this have to do with accessibility? We're here in a web accessibility session. How do we support that change? How do we recognize that the change that needs to happen in education is something that will benefit our goals as well? And these are some of the changes that I think need to happen within accessibility. And I've tried to make these things that might prompt some resistance, because I'm hoping at the end we'll have some discussion and questions and pushback from you. So, some of the things I think we need to add to our cluster of approaches is accessibility strategies that recognize that accessibility is relative to the individual requirements, the goal, and context, and not absolute. Guidelines and regulations that are responsive and evolving, not static. Systems of evaluation that are decentralized and vest authority and judgment at the level of the individual with a disability. And measures of accessibility at the level of the system, not the instance, or the ultimate outcome, not each step used to get there. And I fully recognize that some of these are possibly counter to the approaches that we've taken. And I want to initially say right away that I completely agree with the approach that we've taken, and I don't dispute that we need regulations and that we need success criteria and we need testable criteria. But I think we need to add some additional approaches. So just to very quickly give you some background of where I'm coming from. I'm the director of something called the Inclusive Design Research Center. And what we do is we try to design, proactively, inclusively design emergent information and communication systems, policies, and practices. Or we're working on digital inclusion and designing for diversity. And we've existed since 1993, and in fact there are a few, Greg was part of those beginnings. Everything we do is open source, open access, open standards, and open data. And we have over 96 research partner organizations globally, and we also have an online system that you're all welcome to use, where we store all of our things. We have a master in inclusive design, and the reason I'm introducing this is part of what we train our students as inclusive designers. But the master's in inclusive design is in effect a living lab of inclusive design. It's rather than recruiting all the students from the same disciplinary background or all the best and the brightest students, we try to gather as diverse a cohort as possible, and they become co-creators in their own educational experience. So they function as a post-disciplinary team. They contribute their different lived experiences in a 2-year executive master's with blended delivery. And it is a growing global learning community. And we have something called the DEEP Conference, the Designing Enabling Economies and Policies Conferences in October that I invite you to come to. But the approach that we take to accessibility is a little bit different. We see accessibility as an important tenet of it, but we try to broaden our focus further. When I first thought that we needed something called inclusive design, everyone asked me, well, universal design has 7 principles. You should have a checklist and a set of principles for inclusive design. And I was somewhat resistant to that because one of the aspects of inclusive design is that it is relative. So how can you have a testable set of checkpoints? And so we came up with the notion of the 3 dimensions of inclusive design. The first dimension is recognize diversity and uniqueness. Everyone is different. Everyone requires something different. In fact, people with disabilities, if you think of a common determining factor, it is difference. So we need to recognize that difference. The second is we need inclusive processes and tools. And the third is we need to think about the broader beneficial impact, the system, or the context. So personal, we are all diverse, support personalization, foster self-knowledge, don't make choices for individuals, because individuals need to become experts in their own unique requirements, and integrate, don't segregate. It needs to be participatory, nothing about us without us. We need to engage the end users in the co-design. We need to have tools and systems that are accessibly designed so that everyone can participate in the design. And the learners or the individuals that are co-designers need to be accommodated and need to be able to participate in the system. And this is not just about the tools, but also the processes. And we need to think systemically. We need to be cognizant of the context and the larger impact. And we need to support a virtuous rather than a vicious cycle when we design something, when we make our design choices. No design choice is done in isolation. So how do we apply this to this complex problem? The first dimension, it's personal. And here we need to recognize that we all experience learning barriers. I would contend that disability and accessibility are relative, not absolute. Disability is really not, or the experience of disability isn't a trait, it's an experience of disability, and it's brought about by the mismatch between my needs and what the system, product, service, or environment is offering. If the system, product, service, or environment has all of the things I require, I'm really not experiencing a disability. And in terms of disability, it's not a binary. You're not either disabled or able-bodied. You are non-disabled, or whatever we want to call it, temporarily able-bodied. It's a jagged spectrum. There are a whole range of ways in which the system, the environment, the product can match our requirements or not match them. And therefore, accessibility is the ability of the learning system to match the needs of the individual. And what we have in the education system at the moment is an educational mismatch. Education is essential. We are, however, increasing the number of students disengaging from education. The dropout rates in, how many countries are represented here? How many of you are from the US? How many of you are from Europe? And how many of you are from Canada? Okay, and how many of you are from Australia or New Zealand? Okay, who have I missed? What country have I missed?
Mexico.
Ah,
Spain.
okay, I said Europe. I sort of did a large encompassing thing. Yeah, great. Did I miss any other? No, okay. So I can say that in each case, the dropout rates are increasing. And the reason I say Europe is because there's some countries in Europe that are actually doing it well. But if we take collectively Europe, we have more and more students that are disengaging from learning or formal education at a time when it is so critical and essential to their survival, to their wealth, to their prosperity. We also have this emerging group that is called the doubly marginalized students. They're the students that don't qualify for special education, for special supports, but their needs are also not met by the standard education system. And I would say the mismatch is not just for students. Teachers that spend a great deal of time and change their education practices to accommodate the diversity of students often experience a mismatch with their school. Schools that incorporate progressive systems that are more inclusive face a mismatch with their board, and it goes all the way up. One of the things, though, that we've discovered is that a major success factor, a major reason why students stay engaged and go as far as they can is by recognizing the differences within students. That if we recognize and acknowledge and accommodate the fact that learners learn differently, that there are not only between learner differences, such as motivators, learning style, learning approach, but within learner differences, with respect to the context. I learn math differently than I learn English or poetry or art. And the development or stage of learning, I need very different learning systems when I'm a novice than when I'm an expert. The best learning outcomes happen when there's individualized instruction. The greatest transferable deep knowledge is when there's personal engagement. And I would recommend that you read a book called The End of Average that just came out in February from Todd Rose, if you want to learn more about this notion of the non-average learner and personalized learning. The other thing to note is that a great deal of learning does not come from teacher instruction. It comes from peers, it comes from experiences, it comes from self-directed learning. And personalized learning doesn't mean comfortable learning. It means optimized challenges, challenging everyone optimally. One of the other COBRA effects that has frequently happened within education is that by prioritizing or categorizing individuals with disabilities as requiring help within a school system, we often leave people that we didn't anticipate stranded at the edges. People fall between the cracks. And in fact, one of the other issues with this COBRA effect is that the more effort is taken for one particular group of individuals that are identified as having a disability, the less attention is paid to the edges. The success of one group becomes at the expense of the other. And so I think one of the things we need to do is not look at disability in groupings either. The strategy that we use within, and you don't need to, nobody needs to read this, it's up on the site. What I'm showing is this map, and I'll describe the map for what we create when we design within the Inclusive Design Research Center and within the master's program is this notion of user states and contexts. It's this broad spectrum where the design for the average is in the middle, and there are requirements at the edges. And what we try to do is to look at the many complex facets that come into the design process. And we gather as many edge users or individuals that represent the very edges as we can and design for them individually. And when we gather sufficient individuals that represent edge requirements in our co-design process, then we know we are getting closer to inclusively designing. And among the wedges that we have in this map at the moment is social, sensory, dexterity, cognitive, communication, temporal, learning arrangement, device platform, internet access. All of these are requirements that fit into making sure that the learning experience works for each student. One of the new things that we are working on, though, is a challenge that I don't think we've addressed well enough, and I think we acknowledge that within the Web Accessibility Initiative and within WCAG, and that is this growing requirement of cognitive access. As learners are aging, as web users are aging, there are many, many different cognitive access issues, and in fact, the number of learners that are experiencing things like autism, learning disabilities is increasing, whether it's because we're identifying them or because the incidence is increasing globally. So, what's the second dimension? Inclusive process. We need multiple perspectives when we're coming up with web accessibility and when we're coming up with education. We need to think about who's at the table and where is the table. How many of you think that the full range of individuals that need to be co-designers of, say, the next version of web content accessibility guidelines are able to participate in our standardization groups, on our standardization lists, and in our training and education systems for how to understand WCAG? Okay, no hands. We need to also think about the tools and the processes. One of the things that I would encourage you to look at again or revisit is the importance of accessible authoring tools. We need authoring tools that support accessibility. This is a systemic strategy. I think we need to refocus or add additional emphasis to the authoring tool accessibility guidelines, because authoring tool developers are the ones that will understand the technology, are the source of many of the new strategies that are entering the web, and are also the ones, unfortunately, at the moment that are causing many of the impediments to creating accessible content. So how many of you have tried to, well, actually even just submitting the papers to this conference, how many of you struggled with Word, Adobe, various LaTeX to try to make your papers as accessible as possible? And what sort of workarounds did you have to do? And think about all of the authors out there, all of the content creators. It's completely counter to the workflow. There are technical terms that are not part of standard vocabulary. So we need to think about the authoring tools, the tools and the processes. If we require those authoring tool developers to make them accessible, then we've moved quite significantly. What about in terms of education? One of the things that many teachers say about the process of learning is that you need to be a miracle worker to optimize learning for everyone in my classroom. This is something that one of the teachers stated. But we can contribute to this. If we have an accessible web, then we also have a fairly miraculous web. Because a digital resource shared is not consumed, we have a multiplier effect of sharing and pooling the resources. A digital resource can be automatically transformed. We have amazing plasticity. We can copy without cost. We're not constrained by space and time to some extent when we move to the web from the standard systems that we use for education. And we can depend upon connected classrooms and connected teachers that can share and pool resources, reduce redundancy, polish and refine rather than replicate, attribute using a CC BY license, and most of you know what CC BY is, right? Creative Commons licenses that require attribution. And we have things like open education resources that we can share. So we have a community of networked educators and learners that we can provide through the web, if it is an accessible web. The larger and more diverse the pool, the greater the options, the more likely there will be a match for each learner's uniquely individual needs, and the more likely we can provide a rich and challenging learning experience with the limited resources that teachers have in terms of time and energy. And we can create a system where teachers can become collaborators, and we can support peer-supported learning as well, where one student teaches another. And I'm going to put you through a little bit of an exercise. I want you to find someone close by that possibly you don't know. So not the person you just came with. So find someone to partner with. Okay, I think you've already done the next step. Introduce yourself. Okay, now the next step, and can everybody, once you've introduced yourself, listen for a second? What I want you to do is I want you each to discover something that your partner knows that you don't know, but which you would like to learn. Okay? So I'll give you 3 minutes to discover something that your partner knows that you don't know but would like to learn. Okay, if we can come back now. Can some of you volunteer some of the amazing things you're going to be learning? Jennison, you just shook hands. And it appears. What are you going to be learning?
Oh, do you want me to go to the one?
Sure. Okay. It's right there.
Good morning. Oh, okay. So I was speaking to my colleague from Spain, and he was explaining to me things that he was doing. And one of the things he talked about was football. And I figured, I know that there's a number of different blind sports, but football is not one of them that I've tried. So that would be interesting.
Wonderful. That's great.
Away from all the technology stuff.
Yeah, right. Anyone else have something interesting that they're going to learn? Oh, I'm sure. Well, there was a lot of talk, so there must be lots. Do I need to call out, or is someone going to volunteer?
I need to learn Italian.
Italian. Okay. You can just call it out. I'll repeat it.
We focused on universal design learning.
UDL, Universal Design for Learning.
I learned about
Techniques for teaching engineering students and budding developers. Great. And
Aria?
ARIA, Accessibility for Rich Internet Applications. What did you learn? I think
Ideal holiday destination.
ideal holiday destinations. That's a wonderful. Okay, great. Wonderful. Okay, so one last step. Can you explain to your partner how you each personally learn best? And that, I'm only going to give you 30 seconds, so I don't want you to think about this too much, but what's your preferred way to learn what you were going to learn? Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to let you discuss these and make plans and agree how you're going to connect and learn these things after the session is over, okay? And so what you've just experienced is you have started to form a community of learners, and you've also practiced one of the aspects of how do you intervene in a complex system, and that is you grow from small successes. You collaborate. You invite diversity and diverse perspectives. And so this is one of the seeds or one of the approaches that we can take. And just think of the web as a way to share learning and to distribute the many things that we each know. And I'll talk a little bit more about what might be some of the issues with this. But I want to get to the third dimension. Remember, there were three. So the third dimension is we need to think about the systemic impact. How do we address wicked problems in a complex adaptive systems? As I said, collaboration, agility, responsiveness, a diversity of approaches, resisting reductionism. We need to fail early and often. We currently have very sticky deterministic tests, but in fact, one of the best way to learn is to fail. How many of you have learned how to ride a bicycle or any of those things? And think about how important it is to fail early and often, not at the end of everything you've done catastrophically knowing that you've gone down the wrong path. It's better to know in tiny little increments what you've done wrong. And of course, another thing is humility, not thinking we know it all, not thinking that we have all of the answers, but understanding that there are many of even the problems and the questions that we don't know about as yet. So let's apply this to Web Accessibility Initiative and perhaps, let's say, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Let's think about releasing a new technical criterion, a new success criteria. We will formulate it. We'll probably state it in very testable, specific language so that we know that somebody can meet the criteria. We'll then embed it in policy and law. Likely, if we follow the same pattern that we've followed before, we'll do it without support in the authoring tools. And that is consistently what we've done. We haven't thought about how this is supported throughout the ecosystem. And most likely what will happen is it'll be beyond the technical knowledge of most authors. Think about everybody that authors web content. I mean, I even saw on the web that beyond dogs there are other animals that are now creating web content. And just Google it, you can see that. So the range of authors is huge. And counter to technical trends that rise in popularity. Quite often what we're asking is things that are counter to where the current trends are coming, because the current trends are creating these barriers. But that already pits us against a number of agendas, political agendas, economic agendas, education agendas. And so let's think about how we can address that conflict. And it pits us against the edict to be distinctive, innovative, and current within many of the companies that we're trying to influence. And unfortunately, one of the worst things that frequently happens, if we don't think systemically, if we don't think about the context, if we don't think about diversity, if we don't introduce diverse perspectives, is it quite often may compromise the accessibility for another group of users that we haven't considered. So I would encourage us in our next round of work within the Web Accessibility Initiative, within the Web Accessibility community, to think systemically, to broaden our focus. Some of the strategies that we're working on, well, actually, I'm given time. I'm going to skip 2 slides, so don't look. Okay. Okay. I'll leave lots of questions towards the end. What we want to do is we want to get rid of this vicious cycle that we're currently in of digital exclusion, where many learners, especially learners with disabilities, are experiencing a number of complex and interconnected effects, cobra effects, but also vicious cycles. Lack of inclusive design means there's barriers to participation and representations, means there's lack of design and policy input, which means that there's lack of inclusive design again in that policy. Accessible products are marginalized. Consumers pay higher price for accessible products. There's diminished spending powers by those consumers that require alternative access, which means greater poverty, which means there's greater barriers to education, and all of you can create these types of scenarios. They all exist out there. I'm sure you can all think of examples. What we want to do is we want to create virtuous cycles. And we want to provide optimized access to education, optimized access to employment, greater spending power, diverse participation in all of our actions and decisions, more inclusive design, greater innovation, designing for diversity. We want to facilitate diverse demands, match diverse demands with diverse products and services. Personalization then becomes more mainstream. Inclusively designed products become affordable. There's greater spending power, there's greater prosperity. And you can all think about other virtuous cycles that we could create. You started a virtuous cycle just now by spreading learning further. And the nice thing about complex systems, it is in fact the small successes that then propagate organically as opposed to having to be engineered. I think one of the things we've tried to do is we've forgotten that humility component of complex adaptive systems. We've tried to solve the entire problem right from the start, to think about everything right from the start. And I think what we need to do is to practice some of that humility and agree that we're not going to fix everything right away, but we can start by fixing small things and then growing from those successes. But remember, I was talking about individually unique lifelong journey. What about, is that actually possible? Can we do that within an education system? Remember all of those resistance to change within the education system. Well, one of the things that is happening outside of the accessibility is that there's a recognition within learning analytics, within the education and the pedagogical research, that there's really no normal development. There's no fixed progression through a set of stages of learning. There's no singular set of competencies. And that's very much in line with something that we've known all along in accessible education. In fact, I would contend that learners with disabilities are like the canaries in a coal mine. If something's broken, then they're the first ones to feel it. If something's broken, someone with a disability, a learner with a disability, feels the impact most acutely. And so that's also the indicator of what direction we need to take education. We need diverse learners, and we need to continue learning throughout our life. But many of you may say, well, what about quality and trust? Aren't our systems designed so that we have assurances of quality, that we can trust that when we say something is so, it is so? But even within the education system, we're seeing a deconstruction, decentralization, and disintermediation, long term, of accreditation and certification of academic achievement. We're seeing the rise of things like e-portfolios, open badges, prior learning assessments, and there are even academic institutions that are experimenting with blockchains. Yes, blockchains, those things that were in the evil Bitcoin, but it's actually the disintermediated certificates of trust that are of interest. If I can certify in an irrefutable, immutable ledger that you have taught me how to play football, was it? Or soccer, whatever. Or that then that becomes a credential or a credit that I can then carry on. And what happens if that's the type of credentialing that happens, rather than having to go to Oxford to certify, or the football league to certify that in fact I have learned football. These are things that are currently being experimented with. There is also a move towards recognizing that student agency and self-knowledge is really critical and important. The emphasis on learning to learn, metacognition, transitions and training wheels within education, the need to have transferable knowledge, lifelong learning, self as the representative of the research into what learning works best. So this notion that we can use all of those Internet of Things technologies to determine when am I learning best, to create a little scientific lab for ourselves to become experimenters and scientific investigators into our own learning. What happens when I when I eat breakfast before I start on my math? What happens if I don't stay up all night? What happens if I use images or videos? What if I learn with a friend? And tracking how you learn best and using your own learning analytics. These are all things that are emerging. So, going back to salad dressing, pendula, navel, scraped knees, and future-friendly learning. Can anybody guess what some of these were about? The salad dressing, the pendula, the navels, the scraped knees? No? Okay. So, just to give navel gazing and metacognition. Learners as investigative scientists in their own learning, creating experimental toolkits, data presentation or a manifestation in accessible and tangible forms. And the image I have here is of a little baby discovering their navel, and also a brain thinking about brains, which is part of what we want learners to engage in. Scraped knees and learning through failure and mistakes, the value of mistakes and failure in learning, the opportunity for trial and error, the opportunity to reflect on why and how of failure, and something we call the wabi-sabi principle. The wabi-sabi principle is a Japanese aesthetic about the importance of impermanence, imperfection, and incompleteness for learning. And there's a phenomenon that we've noticed, that if you have impermanence, imperfection, and incompleteness, that engenders the greatest engagement in learning and the greatest learning. Pendulums and polarization versus dynamic balance. We're looking at diversity, not binaries, dynamic equilibrium through diverse perspectives, yes and not but. So yes and something else. We need a diversity of approaches. Collaborate with others and compete with yourself. And we need to think of, within especially the Web Accessibility Initiative, not just the stick, but also some of the carrots and some of the complex processes. But most importantly, the most critical thing within that strange title was the need for social cohesion and how that relates to salad dressing. We need to keep oil, water, and spices in suspension all the time by creating inclusive communities of learners. We need to think about the power of reflexive practice. Let's design way and web accessibility accessibly as well, not just promote web accessibility. And diversity really is our greatest asset globally, within the Web Accessibility Initiative, within the education context within our society. It's not a problem, it's not an issue, it is an asset, it's something we need. We recognize it in economics, we recognize it in biology. Why don't we recognize it as a really critical, important human trait? And inclusion, therefore, is our greatest challenge. We can use that asset by addressing the issue of inclusion. And that's where that funny title came from. And Jess Mitchell is presenting that presentation at the moment. So with that, I want to open it up for questions and suggestions. And I hope I've created enough controversy that there will be some questions and suggestions. sign book.
Shall I get to the-
Yes, please.
Okay. So, thanks. Is this on? Yeah. Thanks for that. It's a really interesting talk. So this question, I've kind of got two, but they might make me seem very cynical, or that I need a tinfoil hat, or maybe I've got me trying to do that. But it seems to me that society values the VIP lounge. It values exclusive access. It values the elite. All these are value terms that society seems to like. It likes to separate. It doesn't seem to like inclusion. It doesn't seem to like that we're all equal. It seems to, even though it says that in politics in some cases, it seems to value these kind of things that aren't. And it also seems to me that corporate society and political society, for them to run as they run, they need a set of people who are either disenfranchised, not educated very well, don't believe that they can learn themselves, and so that they can maintain this kind of separation. People at the top earn more money and go to the VIP lounges, and people at the bottom don't have a good education, don't have any money. So how do you kind of relate these two opposing things, or do you just think that?
Wonderful question. Okay. So we have this term called enlightened self-interest. All of that inequality, all of that exclusion bites you in the end. I mean, how many of you have read The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett? Okay, that's an assignment. Here comes my professor hat. Not my foil hat or tinfoil hat, but my professor hat. Look it up. Wilkinson and Pickett, very early on, before there was any discussion of disparity, talked about how in fact it was equity or equality that was the determining factor of all of the other health factors. And what they showed was, or health factors, or any of those OECD indicators. How many of you have traveled to Brazil or have traveled to countries where there is, well, anywhere, US, right? Where there is great disparity. Where we have disparity, there's greater teenage pregnancy, there is greater mental health issues, there are more people in jail, our public budgets are constrained, our infrastructure is worse, we have greater crimes, we need to increase security. And I think unfortunately slowly, people are starting to recognize that. I talk about 3 potential paths that we can take, and I know this is somewhat oversimplifying, but I can give you the longer. But basically, the first path that we have is the current path, where we have exclusion, where we have this power structure, where we have the haves and the have-nots. We have these echo chambers where the haves continue to get more and rise to power very quickly. And in fact, the web and the way that we've designed the web in some ways accentuates that. We've created these echo chambers that increase the rise up of anyone that is rich, that has influence, that has the attention, that has understanding, and or that is understood, leaving other people not understood because there is not further research in that area. But that's to some extent the world as you just pictured it. But what will happen there is we will have rise and fall of powers. We'll have to spend more and more in security, which will mean that we will have fewer things to spend on making communities, etc. I mean, you can follow that cycle. The other is the charity model, which is also not really that great. That means that those that have to give to those that don't have. And has anyone here tries to raise funds for a particular charity? Yeah, it's a horrid, what do they call it? I mean, it's a terrible process to be in, because you have to continually express how you need more than, you are more pitiable and require more than the next person, how your plight is worse than the next. And you're indebted to whoever is giving you or is providing you with the charity. They control a lot of the direction that you take. And so there's this untenable power imbalance, and so that's not really a good strategy either. The third is investing in inclusion, thinking that enlightened self-interest, recognizing that by making our society more inclusive, by not being exclusive, and by not taking advantage of those power structures that are available to us, those VIP perks, we are contributing in the end to our own prosperity and our own well-being and the well-being of our society. But you're right, that's very utopian and it's whatever. But and you can call me that, but I'm seeing the signs all over the place. I mean, Wilkinson and Pickett were completely vilified in the UK. Anyone that was in the UK, look up how they were critiqued and criticized and called absolute, I don't know, everything for, I mean, the names were humongous. But now, out comes Piketty, and disparity all of a sudden has become an agenda all over the place. Look in the news, look up disparity. It's recognized. Disparity is an issue. And I think that same, I mean, either we're going to get smart or we're going to go. I mean, those are the two paths to some extent. And I think the time is now to stop thinking in the ways that are not in our own self-interest. Okay, yes.
My question is about creating the information. So, for example, we all engage in writing papers, which is easy, but if you wanted to make it more accessible, or you want to create some dynamic content that everyone can master in their own way, but this is much harder. So I wonder if you can say a few things about how you handle that.
Okay, I can tell you in education, I'll tell you in another, actually this is one of the slides I skipped. Where is it? One of the ways that we're doing it, and in fact we were given this challenge in the open education community, and we created something called Flow. The open education community had already created 35,000 open education resources, many of them inaccessible. They were not going to retrofit all of them. And so we said, oh, wait a sec, let's think of another approach. The other approach is, here's a huge diversity of resources. What if rather than looking at it, each resource has to meet a whole set of criteria, we think of it systemically. The system has to provide to each individual what they require. That requires, though, a way for everyone to discover and declare what it is that they need. And so then we created this thing called the Access for All standard, which is a common language for, extensible common language for declaring what it is you require. And it's an ISO standard, ISO 24751. And what then happens is, as you approach the system, it delivers the thing that you want. If I like experiential, complex, highly visual information, it will bring that to me. But if I can't use that, then it will bring something that isn't. So the accessibility requirements are at the system. That's not to say that those highly interactive things should not be made more accessible as well. But here we're coming at it from both bottom up and top down. We are from both that diverse pool through the system, but also the instance. So while we start fixing the instances, we can at least have the system deliver what it is that's required. What that means is versions, and here UDL comes in very handy because UDL also supports this notion that we have differentiated learning, that we need to have a variety of approaches, and we need to think about what each learner needs and deliver that. And so with the Flow system, we've created a cloud-based ecosystem where you can pool resources, and then the individual can explore, discover, and refine their understanding of what it is that they need, request that when they are entering in a learning goal, and the system then delivers the resource that they require. The really interesting additional loop that has come about is that we discovered there were a lot of gaps. There were a lot of resources where nobody had created, say, the captionings or the description. And so we created an additional loop, and we engaged learners or individuals with disabilities, with episodic or invisible disabilities, in actually doing that remediation. So training individuals that face barriers to employment in helping, and we're engaging with the many, many refugees in the UNHCR and ITU refugee camps as well, to address this. And what that does is it increases the human capacity for accessibility, and it makes it easier to pass the legislation, and it provides a greater diversity of additional learning resources. But this is a whole other 2-hour talk. Yes.
I'm Jago from the University of Lisbon. So I heard about coping effect. It made me think that and the definition implies this care when designing and developing new approaches in your system for not being over simplistic. But in the end, you mentioned that also we should fail fast, which is counterintuitive to the over simplistic or can be. So I'd like to have your thoughts.
Right.
So how can we have a good balance between not being over simplistic?
Actually, I would say that failing early and often is a way to make sure we don't have huge cobra effects, because what that implies is that fail early and often means that I try things out the full cycle. And so I can detect, oh, there's going to be an unintended consequence here, and then I can go back. So, I mean, this refers to, waterfall techniques within engineering or design, where there's the big reveal and the pitch. The notion that you do something behind a curtain, or you have to assemble everything before it is released and tested and tried. When in fact what we need to do is we need to try small full cycles that address some small issue that we're attempting, or some component issue, and test that and see how is it not working, and then go back to the drawing board. So design, whether it's of a specification or of a product or a learning curriculum, needs to be a cyclical process where we spiral out to include more and more individuals all the time. Does that? Okay. Any other questions? I think it's break time. No, Jennison, go ahead.
So talking about the web content accessibility guidelines, and your comment about needing to include folks with disabilities as part of the co-design process.
Yeah.
The reality is that the average Joe or Joanne isn't going to be very technical, and may not be in a position to be part of the process, the WCAG process, and joining as a member, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just wondering, how do you see going forward the WAI and others who are working on accessibility better include people with disabilities in the process? Because we all talk about it. We're always saying we need to include people with disabilities, and then the issue is that we can't find them, or they're not interested, or frankly they're working and they have other things to do. So what would be, if you could see it,
Right.
how would you do it?
So I think we need to add additional processes. You're right. I mean, the discussion of the technical requirements is very technical, and it's very difficult but I think we need to bring in all of the other components that come into our end goal. What is our end goal? Our end goal is that every author will be able to create accessible content, and every individual that approaches the web is going to be able to use that content, right, and also produce that content. That's the other thing I want to stress. We are frequently assuming that people with disabilities just need to be consumers, but in fact they need to be producers as well. So I think this is, and maybe it's not just, we can't do it alone as the Web Accessibility Initiative, but I think we need to add further processes that address other parts of that ecosystem that we're trying to create. So what about training programs that give not necessarily technical knowledge, but some of the training that's required to understand the overall ecosystem and how, and even the advocacy and political ecosystem, and even the design of policy. So I have this large diagram that I created that I decided I wasn't going to show, and in fact it's stuck on my Mac, not on my PC, that showed sort of how we could extend the Web Accessibility Initiative to create mechanisms and processes that engage not only individuals with disabilities, but people that are not technically knowledgeable, as you called them, the standard Joe Blow author that would be intimidated by what we're doing and may not in fact be interested, policymakers, authoring tool developers, etc. And I can share that with you.
Jutta, we would like to thank you so much for your presentation today. It's been really, really enlightening, and I know for me it's changed my thought pattern as to how we look at accessibility and how we design for accessibility. We're very indebted to you for your presentation today, and can we thank you very much.